I think where you're left, as you approach the budget with a week to go, is this sort of central narrative, which is the economy is screwed and that's why we're going to have this terrible budget. That's not a message you want the government to be. The government's got to be communicating, yeah, things are tough, but we're having the budget to do this.
How can we say that the big reveal in a week's time is going to be the thing which has been discussed for the last 2 weeks? And what kind of reveal is that?
If you freeze the thresholds, that is the most regressive way of raising money from income tax. That hits the poorest hardest. Whereas if you just raise the main rate of income tax, that actually people who earn more pay more.
People are standing back, scratching their heads and thinking, how could the Treasury be organising this in such a chaotic and incompetent way with all these contradictory briefings? Any conspiracy theory is better than none. Let's alight upon two.
The odd thing about this whole discussion was they were going to risk breaking the manifesto commitment for not very much money.
So we are in the studio in Hoxton and so much to talk about today. But before we do, I have been besieged for the last week by people saying to me, you've got to ask George, because after last week's podcast, a story dropped in the Daily Mail about Peter Mandelson coming round to yours for dinner in West London and then getting caught short waiting for his Ubers late at night, which got cancelled and ended up being photographed, I think, by the Daily Mail, having a piss against a lamppost outside your house. And, I'm not going to ask you who else was there. I'm not going to ask you what the subject of the discussion was. I'm not going to ask whether you were both sharing thoughts about career plans and job opportunities and all that kind of thing. I just want to know, why did Peter Mandelson stay outside? I mean, did you not open the door to him? If he was desperate to relieve himself, why didn't he come back in the house and say, can he use your lube? Why did he decide to break the law, it seems, allegedly, outside in the street? I mean, had you banished him? I mean,
I don't really have
what happened?
I don't really have a very good answer for you, other than, of course, I would have opened the door if he had rung, or indeed, if you had rung and you wanted to come in and use our facilities.
I know hang on a sec.
Yeah.
I might have been walking past and suddenly think to myself, I need to relieve myself. Shall I pop round to George's? He had been at your house for dinner for the previous 3 hours. Why didn't it occur to him to come back and ring the doorbell? He didn't ring the doorbell again then?
No. Anyway, you can ask him if you like, because goodness knows. But I tell you what.
Can you not give us any insight?
Well, not really, except that I feel, pretty sorry for him, to be honest. But, when you got to go, you got to go. And which is why I've gone before we sit down and record this podcast.
When you've got to go, you've got to go. I mean, there is so much in that phrase.
Anyway, I'm going to use this as a rather clunky segue to something which is much more edifying, which is we are auctioning on this podcast a very large bottle of Pol Roger champagne, right? Which definitely, if you drink this Jeroboam, which is 3 litres of champagne, you will need to go to the loo at some point. But it is...
That's a terrible segue.
It is a terrible segue. But anyway, it's for a really, really, brilliant cause. This is to raise money for Sarcoma UK. And this is in the memory of someone we both knew really well, Chris Martin, who was a civil servant, ended up being the top civil servant in Downing Street, the principal private secretary to David Cameron, and then tragically died at the age of 42. And his widow, Zoe, has done a brilliant job ever since that tragic death of raising money and awareness for sarcoma. And this bottle of Pol Roger is signed by all 9 living prime ministers. So I know we have got some people who listen to the show who are political obsessives, who like to collect some memorabilia. This is a pretty unique thing. This is a bottle signed by all 9 living prime ministers. And if there's a new prime minister in the next year, we'll get them to sign it too.
Definitely. This is a fundraiser for sarcoma, which is happening next Thursday night, the 27th. I've actually compared it for the last 10 years. It's been going for a number of years, all raising huge amounts of money for Sarcoma UK. And George and I are going to do a political quiz. I think we might share some of our questions for our Golden Kitchen Cabinet subscribers in due course from that quiz. But this is an auction. In the show notes, you can see how you can bid for this bottle of champagne. I mean, very special. I should just point out that although it is being signed by all 9 living prime ministers, and all 9 living prime ministers have agreed to sign it, one of them apparently has not got round to it yet. So it's currently signed by 8, but it's going to be signed by the 9th. Guess who is the prime minister who hasn't quite got round to signing the bottle?
Well, you told me so, but I think I would have got there. Boris Johnson is a busy guy.
He's a very, very busy guy. He's travelling all around the world doing important things. I don't know what they are, but he's almost certainly making speeches, which are probably totally unprepared, but it doesn't matter because and to be honest, he could buy this bottle of champagne and probably blow all of our listeners out of the water with a bid.
He could probably buy Paul Roger Vineyard at this rate. It's Churchill's favourite champagne, of course, and Boris Johnson styled his career on Winston Churchill, although some of the parallels didn't work out in the way that he wanted them to.
And the great thing is, if he was to bid for the bottle, we could take it round for him and then he could sign it and then keep it.
Yeah.
So it's 2 birds with 1 stone. Anyway, it's in the show notes, and it's going to close next Thursday, the 27th at 10 p.m. So you've got a whole week to bid if you would like to, and for a great cause, and also I think a great auction prize, a bottle of champagne signed by 9 living prime ministers, currently 8. Boris to come.
It's already been bought, so even if the budget puts up taxes on champagne, you will not have to pay them. So, which, by the way, is another segue to say we are going to be talking about the budget, aren't we, on this show? We've got a week to go. It's been a pretty chaotic week since we last recorded a podcast and talked about the budget. And it looks like there's been a big U-turn on whether to put up income tax, the rates of income tax, and instead they're going to go for what they're calling a smorgasbord of tax rises. Anyway, we are going to talk about the budget with a week to go.
Well, we're going to start with the budget. And a week ago, we were recording this podcast. And after a dramatic 2 weeks in British politics, we'd had the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, doing that very unusual live press conference at 8:10 in Downing Street, in which she had basically said taxes are going up. By saying everyone must do their bit, she was signalling, and that was absolutely what was being encouraged by all of her media advisors, that this was going to be breaking her manifesto commitments not to raise income tax, VAT on national insurance. And that was then followed up with an interview with Matt Chorley of the BBC the following Monday of last week, in which she repeated that manifesto point. She said she could stick with her manifesto, but the cost of that in terms of cuts to capital spending would be so big. And we in our podcast last week were saying, well, this is controversial, challenging, because the politics of breaking a manifesto like that is quite significant. On the other hand, it's hard to see how she can credibly go after the scale of tax rises she needs without breaking the manifesto. And she was getting huge plaudits from the financial markets for the clarity of that commitment to raise income tax. That's where things had landed. And then our podcast landed on Thursday evening, and then at 10 at night, a story to the Financial Times, a further momentous U-turn. The government, we were told, has ripped up these plans. The Chancellor is no longer going to raise income tax. She's no longer going to break her manifesto commitment. Led to complete chaos on the financial markets on Friday. And so a week out, where does this leave the budget? That's what we're going to talk about now. Before we do, here's a quick reminder of Rachel Reeves' journey to today.
I did not come into politics to raise taxes on working people. So my promise to you is this. Labour will not put up your income tax, national insurance or VAT. That extending the threshold freeze would hurt working people. It would take more money out of their payslips. I'm keeping every single promise on tax that I made in our manifesto. So there will be no extension of the freeze in income tax and national insurance thresholds.
Public services now need to live within their means, because I'm really clear I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes.
At the budget, we protected working people by keeping our promise not to raise their rates of national insurance, income tax or VAT.
Every time, on every issue, it is Labour that is standing up for working people and standing up for our national interest. So when you leave this hall, when you return to your communities and your workplaces, let the message ring out. that there is only one party that was founded by working people and only one party that is committed absolutely to defending their interests.
If we are to build the future of Britain together, we will all have to contribute to that effort. Each of us must do our bit for the security of our country and the brightness of its future. It would, of course, be possible to stick with the manifesto commitments, but that would require things like deep cuts in capital spending.
I mean, look, the long and short of it is it's a complete fiasco. It's one thing to say, I'm going to break the manifesto commitment for the reasons she gave right at the end there, because the world is different. And, you know, the cost of keeping to the manifesto commitments are deep cuts in public expenditure, which as a Labour Chancellor, I'm not prepared to do. And they were laying the ground for that. That's precisely what they were laying the ground for. And the plan from the Resolution Foundation originally, that think tank which Torsten Bell helped set up and is now helping on the budget as a Labour minister, was that you put an income tax up by a couple of percent and then you cut national insurance by a couple of percent, or a couple of pence, I should say, in both cases. And most working people are no worse off, but you are taxing people like pensioners and unearned income and so on. That was the plan. It was clearly the plan. It was submitted to the OBR, and they were laying the ground in public for the breach of the manifesto. And we said, and we weren't the only people to say it, that is a big gamble. You know, breaking your manifesto promise on income tax, being the first chancellor in 50 years to raise income tax. This is a huge, huge deal. But they'd kind of clearly got to that point. What is extraordinary is then to hit the kind of screeching U-turn. What is not so strange in the history of budget making is to still be having big decisions a couple of weeks out. So I think, you know, for people who say, oh, it's all a bit chaotic, sometimes in budgets, you are still making big calls on policy a couple of weeks out. But what you're not doing is doing it in public and starting to lay the ground for the thing you're about to do. And then doing that U-turn. And the U-turn, it is a U-turn. I don't think actually the leak to the Financial Times was deliberate, as I understand it. So I don't think they were expecting it to be in the paper, but it was. And it, as you say, it had this real world impact, which, by the way, everyone who listens to this podcast and lives in Britain is paying for, which is more expensive money because of bond yields and more, a cheaper currency, so less money compared to other people in the world. That's the real world consequences. And, it has, I'm afraid, completely kind of torpedoed the attempt to tell a story about this budget, which, many people, including us, have been urging them to do. And I think where you're left as you approach the budget with a week to go, and we can come on and discuss, what might be in it, but is this sort of central narrative, which is the economy is screwed and that's why we're going to have this terrible budget. That's not a message you want the government to be. The government's got to be communicating, yeah, things are tough, but we're having the budget to do this. And there's this, there was this opinion poll that was published this week by YouGov, which asked the question, how is the government handling the economy? And only 1% of the population, 1% of the population think the government is handling the economy very well. And for context, and I'm borrowing here from a lobby journalist, Jason Groves, who pointed this out. So 1% of the country thinks the government's handling the economy well. 4% of people think Prince Andrew's doing a good job. So, it is pretty dire. I think if you were trying to look for a kind of silver lining, you would say at least still anchored in people's minds and the market's minds, despite the movements last Friday, is a clear view she is still going to meet the fiscal rules that she set out. That there's not going to be a dramatic kind of loosening of policy, and as a result, you're unlikely to get a kind of big adverse bond market reaction when the budget is finally presented. But you will end up with a set of things which are going to be quite difficult to explain to the public, not least because you're now shone a big spotlight on them, including income tax thresholds, which you being frozen, which Rishi Sunak did for many years. So you could, you can point that out as a Labour Chancellor that your predecessor did it. But, she was there on the record in the House of Commons saying they hurt working people and I'm not going to do it. So even that's going to be pretty hard for her to swallow.
They are definitely back now to what is called the smorgasbord budget, which is they have to have lots of tax rises.
Do you like a smorgasbord? Are you when you're on holiday and do you like the fact there's a bit of cheese and herring and salami, or you just no, give me my I don't want this Scandi smorgasbord.
We actually started our holiday the year before last in Stockholm in a little kind of hut, kind of holiday place by a fjord just outside of Stockholm, and I put together a very good smorgasbord. But I wasn't trying to win the confidence of the international financial markets while I was doing it. It had a rather small audience who gave me a big thumbs up. I also cooked a paella in Stockholm, which has nothing to do with Sweden, and has nothing to do with this podcast either. The thing about the smorgasbord problem,
By the way, I wonder whether they have fjords in Sweden. Just saying, might be a Norwegian thing.
But anyway, there was a lot of water. We'll come back to water later. And so the problem is that if you've got to put together lots of different smaller tax rises, it's harder because they've got to add up, they've got to work. There'll be lots of questions raised about, well, if they do a rise in gambling taxes, is that going to bring in the money? Because or are you going to see gambling companies moving abroad? There was an ITV story from Joel Hills this week about Sky Bet apparently already moving out to Malta or to Gibraltar in terms of their domicile. Who gets hit in terms of people's savings or their pension savings? I think they've ruled out when they were going for the income tax rise this hit to partnerships. The point, though, is that the markets had been told, no, we're not doing that. We're doing a clean tax rise for everybody, which will bring in the money and rebuild the margins. And, that was the messaging. And we were talking last week about the financial markets. And I said, this briefing, which we'd seen from Keir Starmer and from Number 10, from Rachel Reeves' people as well, that no, we must stay in post because we're the people the markets trust. And we said, well, that is a bit of a hostage to fortune if the markets turn against you. And it might be that the market moves. It could be because they're worried you might be moved, but it could also be the market moves because they're worried that what you're doing is a bit chaotic all over the place. And on that Friday of last week, when suddenly the clean tax rise was off the table, the rise in markets wasn't because Rachel Reeves was going to get sacked. It was because people thought, well, this is chaos. This is not what you've been telling us for the last 2 weeks. Who is in charge of this process? It's led to two kind of odd speculative theories. One is that Keir Starmer actually thought that if you raised the prospect of an income tax rise and then said, aha, no, we're not doing it, that would be good news. People would feel good about it. Although
I think that's retrofitting the what happened.
It's absurd.
They were clearly thinking very, very seriously about doing it.
And the second theory is maybe the Treasury was trying to say they'll do income tax to manipulate the markets, to reduce the bond yield so that the OBR in their forecast would score less debt interest savings. And then once the forecast has been completed by the OBR, you say, no, we're not actually. And at that point, market rates go up again. But
I wouldn't put that past the Treasury.
No, but it's ridiculous. I mean, look, both of these theories tell you that people are standing back, scratching their heads and thinking, how could the Treasury be organising this in such a chaotic and incompetent way with all these contradictory briefings? Any conspiracy theory is better than none. Let's alight upon two. By the way, the idea that this was done by two Treasury officials, this wasn't done by the political Treasury. I find that really hard to believe. I don't know, but I just don't. In my experience, Treasury officials don't go and brief about the budget 10 days out, especially about something as sensitive as the OBR forecast. And if you look at the original FT story, it didn't say the OBR forecast is improved. It said that that after the huge political reaction to the botched Keir Starmer Number 10 briefing against Wes Streeting, combined with Lucy Powell, the new deputy leader, it turns out Wes Streeting subsequently all saying you must keep to the manifesto, they made a political decision that the cost of breaking the manifesto was so great they had to get off it, and that was the U-turn. And I have to say, I find that rather more plausible.
But ultimately, the right calculation, right? I mean, I think it would have been extremely hard. And the other odd thing, by the way,
we disagreed on this because I've always said I wouldn't start from here, but I never thought that this was the right manifesto commitment to make. I always thought that
you thought therefore it could be having started from here. The odd thing about, by the way, this policy, it was only going to raise £6 billion.
if they did the national insurance offset,
Yeah.
which we don't know they were going to do, they could have just
So
done
what
the
is
income tax.
It seemed to me like, why were you going to make? We don't want to. This isn't a history show, so it's clear they're not going to do this now. But the odd thing about this whole discussion was they were going to risk breaking the manifesto commitment for not very much money and not solving their problem. And the income tax thresholds, which absolutely you can legitimately argue is also a break of the manifesto, because Rachel Reeves was attacking it before the election. You heard that in the clip from the Labour election broadcast, which was the first bit of the clip. She was saying it again in her budget last year. I mean, that is a tax on working people. And let's be absolutely clear, because there'll be lots of progressive people listening to this show. If you freeze the thresholds, that is the most regressive way of raising money from income tax. That hits the poorest hardest, because it hits someone earning £12,570, which is where the threshold is, and they get, or just a bit above it, they get dragged into that threshold. Whereas if you just raise the main rate of income tax, that actually people who earn more pay more. So so it's got a long history in British politics as a kind of stealth tax. And as Chancellor, partly at the urging of the Liberal Democrats, we actually doubled the threshold because it was a progressive thing to do, from around £6,500 to £12,500 by the time I left. They are going back to the kind of later Tory policy of three, and now there's going to be so much attention on it. It's not going to be. There's no chance this is going to be a stealth tax. It's going to be widely reported, and it looks like you're also going to have like a high value property tax, which or additional council tax bands, which I also looked at as we discussed in the show, albeit to use it to cut income tax.
Although we have to be so careful, because
we don't know. Yeah.
A week ago we were saying there's going to be an income tax rise because that's what we were being told so clearly.
We don't know.
I mean, to answer your question, I wouldn't have made the manifesto commitment. I wouldn't have said what was said in last year's budget. I would have used the spring to get off the manifesto commitment because the world had changed. When we discussed this a few weeks ago, about whether breaking the manifesto at that point for Rachel Reeves was doable, you said no, and I said it's really difficult. I can't see what the alternative is, because I fear that the smorgasbord isn't going to work. But once they decided to tell everybody they were going to do it, I thought, well, that is brave, but also it's consistent with the strategy of getting this done and getting through the next 3 years and hoping that things turn around. To say you're going to do it and then change your mind that is the thing which feels so wildly
well, to do it in public, isn't it? As I say, that's the odd thing. When you were kind of clearly laying the ground, as we heard. Now, we did, it reminds me of something that was messaged to me earlier this week by one of our political editors, who said, have you discussed Ed Balls for Chancellor on your pod recently?
That's a bit like saying, discussing Andy Burnham for Prime Minister. But, Andy Burnham is not a member of Parliament, and neither am I. And I have no intention of becoming...
I think if I asked Andy Burnham, he might say he wants to be a member of Parliament. Well, in fact, that Labour MP, Clive Lewis, who is the Norwich South MP, a town close to your heart.
Former seat of Charles Clarke.
Right, and he's volunteered...
Who lost his seat to the Liberal Democrats with a bit of help from the Greens. So, complicated seat to step into. Anyway,
so you've certainly done your homework. Look, I think it's a bit facetious all this, but what is it comes back to, and we don't want to sound like a stuck record on this podcast, but it's all about, in politics, you have policies, and ultimately you are judged whether those policies succeed or not in the real world. But you do have to set them in the context of a story and a narrative, and you have to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that is particularly the case when you are asking people to give you more of their own money by raising their taxes. And, with a week to go, where do you think we are in terms of, this is where I started this segment, the budget narrative? Because it seems to me there's nothing now left other than the economy is in the mess, so I'm afraid the budget's not going to be very nice.
The budget narrative has completely collapsed into chaos, and that attempt to set out the budget narrative was done in that unusual press conference at 8:10 in the morning in Downing Street, which was clearly designed to pave the way for a decision about taxes, which has now been removed. Now, I felt at the time it was too backward-looking about who was to blame in the past, and there wasn't enough of a story about the vision for the future, the growth plan, what we need to do together to improve our public services. But even that is sort of has been ditched. So I don't know what the narrative is. I think there's one other point I would like to say, which is
probably the two-child policy is going to be the big reveal on the day, isn't it?
Well,
a watering down of or a abolition of. Yeah.
Well, in a way, that's the point I want to make, because how can we say that the big reveal in a week's time is going to be the thing which has been discussed for the last 2 weeks? And what kind of reveal is that? Something weird has happened. I know this probably started actually with Alistair Darling, but I think it's something which has taken over just in the most recent years, which is this discussion in public of the budget and budget measures in such a sort of open and briefed way. I mean, these days, it happened in the FT last week with that story where the spokesman says that the Treasury doesn't comment on budget speculation, and you kind of laugh out loud because the Treasury is clearly behind all of this budget speculation, and it didn't used to be this way. And there is such a double standard here. If you work in the private sector, if you're working in a bank or in a big fund or in a regulated financial services company, in a company as well, there are such strict rules about how information is passed and shared, the way in which your phones are monitored, what you're allowed to say to other people in your own organisation, which are both in criminal law but also in the regulatory framework. And that sort of respect for market-sensitive information, I think, was also reflected in the way in which the Treasury used to go about budget making. You remember Dalton in 1947 having to resign as Chancellor because he mistakenly said to the Evening Standard a few things which were going to be in the budget an hour before he delivered it.
Yeah, he went like tuppence up on beer, 1 pence up on cigarettes, and then he had to resign. Labour's last old Etonian Chancellor.
The budgets I was involved in, on the day of the budget, so this is not like a week before, the day of the budget, we would have come in the morning, the political editor of the BBC, ITV and Sky, and have a conversation. It would be me and the head of communications, full knowledge of the permanent secretary. We would talk through the message of the budget, but also, broadly, the order in which things would unfold. There is no way in that conversation we would ever mention any of the individual measures, because the view was that was market sensitive, and you couldn't say market sensitive things to journalists in advance. And what was said last Thursday night to the FT about ditching the income tax rise, that was clearly massively market sensitive because it moved markets the next day, and that's happened again and again. And I don't understand why we've ended up in a situation where the Treasury, politically, but it also seems the official Treasury, is allowing a market-sensitive rolling speculation coming from within the institution about budget measures, which, if that was happening in the private sector, there would be kind of massive anger and regulatory investigation. And it's I'm not saying that it's leading to people trading on the basis of this information, although they clearly could. I'm just saying it's so disorderly and inappropriate, and I don't understand how it's happened.
Well, I think that it's a good question. I think there are two things there. So the first is, I think the Treasury, certainly in my day, did respect things that were genuinely market sensitive. So, for example, when I announced big changes to pensions and the requirement to annuitise or getting rid of the requirement.
First I knew about that was when you said it in the budget
but
statement.
it had to be
Absolutely.
had to be top secret because it affected the share price and bond prices in a big way. Of course. And second, when I announced the sugar tax, that had an impact on the share price of Coca-Cola and the like. Although they more than coped with it. So I think there was always a high degree of sensitivity around things that were market sensitive. But the truth was, and this was true when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, and certainly once I'd been Chancellor for a bit, we weren't going to be moving the UK gilt market and the stock market with our budgets. They didn't really have it. They'd gone were the days when.
Although Rachel Reeves has been.
Of course, no, but that's my point. That there was, I think, a kind of laziness came into the trade. I don't mean laziness in a bad way. I just mean people thought, well, it doesn't really matter if we allow a bit of speculation about income tax and whatever, and whether we're going to put up the thresholds or freeze it, because fundamentally this is not actually going to move the bond market or the stock market. And the truth is now, because Britain's right on the edge again of the confidence in the bond market, things like this are making big movements that, by the way, involve many tens of billions of pounds in these markets moving around and prices shifting. So it's partly a reflection of the fact we are back into a time when everything the government says on the economy is very, very market sensitive. And second, I think it's true, Alice Darling, you mentioned, he was the first Chancellor who used to then do the Sunday show, which is the Andrew Marr show back then, before his budget on the Sunday before. And I felt kind of obliged to carry it on, though maybe that was a mistake. And, because he had sort of set the precedent. And I thought it was a very uncomfortable TV appearance when you only got a couple of days to the budget. Absolutely, it's all done and dusted and the speech is written and so on. But certainly into the kind of Treasury's official thinking, press office thinking, as well as the special advisor team and number 10 was make sure there are no nasty surprises on budget day, so that all that is left are the good things, the extra money being spent on things or the tax cuts. So tax increases where they weren't market sensitive to particular companies were generally briefed out. And I think if you've looked at recent years under the last, there were 7 chancellors since me, so there's plenty of different examples. But that became the kind of practice. It's just we're now in a very, very different world because of that bond market jitters. Started under Liz Truss, but certainly there now with Rachel Reeves. And you return to the original thinking behind budget secrecy when we used to have a more closed economy, which is these things really do matter now.
And it goes wider than the bond markets. I mean, this is there's a very good daily email which comes from the Times business people. This is Richard Fletcher, business editor, on Monday morning. Budget speculation takes its toll. Further evidence this morning of the damage being wreaked by mounting speculation of tax rises ahead of next week's budget. They have House Builder Chris Nicholson blaming continuing uncertainty surrounding government tax policy as it warns its full-year profits will be at the low end. 2 separate surveys overnight, big falls in business confidence. The truth is that if you have this rolling speculation, then everybody thinks, well, until I know where it's going to be, because I think I might be in the frame, I'll just make no decisions. And so it is blighting. I would say the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury needs to have a look at this. I think the Treasury Select Committee needs to have a look at this. We need to ask, are the rules which are now governing the way in which governments go about managing information flows before budgets really fit for purpose? Because I think the private sector is working by much higher standards and the government used to, and I think it's actually dangerous and destabilising. And I think that's much more important, by the way, than whether the OBI has 1 or 2 forecasts in a year.
Yeah, but all that speculation, which you're right, and there was a Barclays survey, isn't it, that it's saying that it's hit investment decisions by small and medium-sized businesses over recent months and so on. It's clearly having a significant impact on business confidence, all this speculation about the government's economic policy. But, frankly, it's not about whether things are being leaked from the budget. It's because people sense there isn't a plan. That's the overall problem here. So I come back to kind of where I started, which is we're a week to go to the budget and we don't know what this budget is supposed to do or where it fits into a plan.